What do abstinence pledges, purity balls, true love waits rings, and passing cups of spit around a circle of teenagers have in common? That's right, purity culture. How did a campaign meant to celebrate sexual wholeness and protect teenagers from the dangers of casual sex end up shaping a generation of people, often ending up with a skewed sense of how to think about their relationships and their bodies? How do we go from the fact that sex is a gift from God to the message of sex is bad? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. We're excited to have you. Theology on Air, as many of you know, is an offshoot of Theology on Tap, which is a ministry in Houston to young adults where we gather around craft beer, most importantly, and interesting, relevant issues of theology, philosophy, faith, and culture. And we get a lot of questions about sex and how does the leadership team think about various questions around this topic. And so this is part of our broad series, All Things Sex. And we're rounding out with a conversation with our guest I'll tell you about in a second. But I'm Sarah Stone. I am the Director of Community and Evangelistic Outreach at MDPC. I'm joined by Evan McClanahan, Senior Pastor here at First Lutheran in Midtown. And our guest today is Jay Stringer. Jay is a licensed mental health counselor, ordained minister, and internationally requested speaker on the subject of unwanted sexual behavior. Kind of a weird thing to be a requested speaker on, right? But he's written a book called Unwanted. We'll be unpacking some of the thoughts in there in a bit, but welcome. And if there's anything that you want to know about Theology on Tap, Theology on Air, listen to more of our podcasts, send us all the love. You can find out everything you need to know at houstontot.com. And if you enjoy this podcast series, share it. I think that's the best way that we can grow is tell a friend and have them give it a listen. Especially, I think this is going to be a good episode because most of our audience was at least affected or sort of tangentially affected by purity culture. So, Jay, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sarah, thank you for having me on. Evan, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for being
here. You wrote a book, which is not actually explicitly about purity culture, but it is about unwanted sexual behavior, sexual desires, and a lot of that, I think, is affected by the messaging from purity culture. So before we get into what all that is and what it means, tell us just a little bit about you, your own journey of faith, maybe, and what brought you to be excited about this topic or want to research it.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Even as you read the list of purity balls and spit cups, I don't know about your listeners, but I just had this like, get me out of here. I want to run, which says a lot about where I come from. It's an odd thing to be interested in like unwanted sexual behavior and to make that a career out of that. I know my middle school self would just be horrified if I knew that this is what I'd be speaking about, researching about so consistently. But so if I were, two stories that often come to mind for me in this space would be, I was a pastor's kid. My dad was a Presbyterian minister growing up.
Mine too. We're the same.
Yeah. And so I grew up with, there wasn't a pastoral counselor on staff. It was kind of like people reach out to the pastors if they're going through a mental health or a spiritual health issue. And so I have just a lot of memories of, people would try to get in touch with my dad at church, but then if they couldn't get a hold of him there, they would leave a message on our home answering machine about
we're in the days
various
of an answering machine.
Yes, this is even pre-cell phone. So that was always just like, before Netflix. And this was like, oh, wow, there are stories that people are functioning out of. And I would have no idea that this is happening in the life of this family on a Sunday morning. But wow, crisis is often where people tell the truth about their life. So there were certainly some boundary issues that I wish my parents had addressed, like not leaving an answering machine next to the dinner table so that we could hear everything. But one of the initial stories that I remember was there was an elder in my dad's church that had an affair, and his wife had called our home answering machine and was breaking down in tears. And I could very quickly get a sense of, okay, my dad's going into crisis mode to be able to attend not just to this betrayed spouse, but also to an elder, a friend of his in the church that had had an affair. But then also watching my mom be both heartbroken that this was happening in their marriage, but she was also losing her husband again for, I don't know, second or third time that week. And so that was very quickly my role in the family, was to get a sense of, how do I ease some of the tension in my home? So can I do the
Hmm.
dishes? Can I
Hmm.
ask my mom how she's doing? Can I be the, good godly son? But that was part of, early on for me in terms of story and paying attention to, you know, uh, there's a dynamic in my family of origin that needs to be attended to, but then there's also all this stuff within the church. And so was really intrigued by that early on, of how do people tell the truth of their life, not in the church or in small groups, but
Hmm.
far more through their crisis
Yeah.
and that crises. And that's always been interesting to me. And then, I go to seminary, get into grad school, and long story short, found myself like working with you know people who would buy sex in the Seattle area. So they were called Johns, and so I was
Hmm.
part of something in the city of Seattle called the John School. And very quickly, just seeing a lot of the patterns in these men's lives, and then you read certain Christian books, and it's like, slapping rubber bands around your wrists, getting internet
Right.
monitoring is not going to help these guys at all. They've tried
Mm.
a lot of that. And I refer to all of that as kind of lust management, where you try to bounce your eyes, you get accountability, internet monitoring. And I could just see from a clinical standpoint, it was not helping. In fact, it was actually even more detrimental to the problem of someone's life. And so, just really curious with regard to why do people do what they do. And so that, seeing those patterns led to a decision on my end to do research of what could we learn, instead of just, 70% of men watch porn, or a third of, porn users are now women, or you read a lot of the stats from the leading porn sites that are releasing what are the top 10 searches that exist out
Hmm.
there. I wanted to know, why do people do what they do? So instead of it just being, here's how big the problem is, that stuff just doesn't interest me. Like, we already know it's an issue.
Right.
And so that was the decision to do research, is to really get a sense of what is driving this, and could we ask people to tell us their story, and could the results that we find actually aid our collective freedom? And so I can get into the research later on if we want to, but the basically what we found was unwanted sexual behavior, like the use of porn, buying sex, certain unwanted fantasies that people would have, were not random at all. They were always a direct reflection of parts of someone's story that hadn't been addressed. And so
Hmm.
the big implication that I found in my book was, unwanted sexual behavior is a roadmap to healing, not this life sentence to sexual shame or sexual addiction that
Hmm.
at least I had grown up believing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you talk in the book a fair amount. I mean, I was listening on audiobooks, so at the end, they would say questions for reflection. It there's a lot of talk about instead of shying away from your unwanted sexual fantasies, really leaning in and exploring what those fantasies are, why you might have them, which we may
Mhm.
get into that in a little bit, but I'm just curious, like how did you go about, you talked to like thousands of people, right? I mean, what did you do? Like put out a survey, like who wants to tell us about your deepest, darkest sex secrets? And people are like, yeah, I'll do that. I mean, how did that even
Exactly.
work?
Yeah. Yeah, so we designed a survey and had, a team at New York University handle a lot of the analytics with it, to just make sure that it was, psychometrically sound. I'm not a PhD researcher by background, so outsourced a lot of the heavy research analytics lifting to someone else. But just paying attention to patterns that, as from my clinical practice, I could tell that, the searches that people would have on the internet were always very interesting to me, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of, why would this woman be interested in kind of more aggressive forms of sexual
Mm-hmm.
fantasies, and then the next woman that I meet with seems to kind of reenact something of her own abuse within some of these dynamics, or this next guy that I'm meeting with, he has this particular sexual fantasy. And so we kind of took some of the top, I think it was the top 20 search for terms on the internet, mother oriented themes, youth, young, teenager, mother oriented, incest related themes. And we kind of looked at, could those, if those were kind of the outcome measure of this is what people would pursue, what could we learn about, the key drivers of each of those porn searches?
Hmm.
And we found that you could actually predict porn searches based in parts of someone's story. So
Yeah.
one of that, what like one quick example of that would be, let's say that you were a man who wanted to see a college or a teenager, maybe a race that suggested to you some level of subservience. This was largely about men that wanted some level of power
Hmm.
in their fantasy. Well, what we found from those men was that the key drivers of that were having a strict father growing up, uh, a lack of purpose in their adult life, and high levels of shame. And
Hmm.
so, if you just play like armchair psychologist just for a little bit, you can get a sense that if you grew up in a very rigid home with a very domineering or authoritative father, that father, in a way, specialized in creating powerlessness, right? So it's kind of
Hmm.
his way or the highway, a lot of rules, lots of regulation. And so, in the midst of that, this man seemed to try and find a way of life in porn where he could override some of that powerlessness and find exactly what he wanted without having a lot of control. Or let's
Hmm.
say that you have a lot of lack of purpose in your life. Like you look back at your life and you see a lot of failure, or it's, you're trying to get something started in your career, but you're just like, I can't find any direction. Every startup that I try and engage, everything always fails. Well, in the midst of the thorns and thistles of life, to borrow from Genesis 3, there's going to be a need for a man to find compensatory pleasure or mastery when something of
Hmm.
his everyday life can't function correctly. And so porn is so appealing because you can get exactly what you want when you want it. It's not just about lust. It's a realm of control. It's a realm of certainty. And so again, just that sense of if you are a man just trying to stop it or just try and become more spiritual or pray these things away or get into accountability, but you're not addressing your story, like your relationship with your father or your relationship to powerlessness or purposelessness, you're going to stall in your efforts to outgrow porn. So,
Right.
porn is a clarion call to a lot of issues in someone's life that have not been addressed. But in Christian circles, we try to address, the porn problem without saying, no, like the porn problem is actually identifying a lot of stories that have not been
Hmm.
addressed and attended to. So I'm looking at sexual problems as signals of themes in our life that need healing.
Yeah. It's, I think when we try to do the whole what you call sin management or lust management, we
Hmm.
often inadvertently send someone into more of a shame spiral, which just makes more of the behaviors happen. So I'm curious,
Yes.
and I'm going to move into purity culture here soon, I promise. But I'm curious if you have seen or witnessed someone that finally figures out where that came from and kind of explores their family of origin and really does some honest work. Do you see a reduction in the amount of unwanted sexual desire or sexual behavior? Like,
Oh
have you
yeah,
have you
big time.
witnessed that?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, there's different routes that people like. So there is some people that will. Oh, I'm trying to think of an example that isn't like too far into the deep end.
Well, people can
But
get your book for that too.
yes,
So,
yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of sometimes like I'll just kind of talk a little bit about my story. So part of those dynamics with my own mom that I discussed earlier.
mhm,
Well, some of that I would put in the category of emotional enmeshment or triangulation. So I
mhm,
would say, in some ways, my family, both my parents, but especially my mom, used me throughout different points of my life to be something of an emotional surrogate to her
mhm,
in the midst of everything that was happening in the church, the breakdown in my parents' marriage. So that was kind of my first therapy appointment, was with my
Mm.
mom, to get a sense of how is she doing, but I'm being used, right? And so it when it
Unwittingly. I mean, she doesn't know
yes.
that she's doing that. Yeah.
Well, that's where I would say I'm not quite sure. I think most parents are not doing the best that they can, and I
Mm.
know that would be a pushback against a lot of the contemporary. I think she had an idea of how I was being brought in to kind of provide a role that she
Okay.
knew I wasn't supposed to be playing. But we could debrief. That'd be a good
Mm.
discussion of our parents doing the best that they can. Uh, so that was happening with my mom, but I have to, connect the dots with regard to, a mother is supposed to be there more for me, for my needs, for my nourishment as a child. But I was adultified very early on. And so
Hmm.
part of my porn preferences and even my, fantasy life were basically around mother oriented themes, or with regard to how could I show up in a woman's life in the midst of her crisis or heartache. So
Mm-hmm.
even though my mom, never abused me, the relational template that she put in place affected my sexual life, right?
Yeah.
And so does that make sense?
Yeah. But I mean,
So
the question is, I mean, to put it crassly, like, have you seen results? And I don't need to know about your own, but I just mean, when you're talking with these people, do you notice that it's like, man, I haven't needed to look up those porn things as much as I did before,
mhm.
because now I realize this dynamic was going on.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting to.
Oh,
So,
sorry.
when I had to realize that a lot of my unwanted sexual behaviors were actually unresolved stuff with my mom, part of what I had to recognize is a lot of the searches were a way to deal with what was unresolved with my mom and some of the unaddressed anger. And so, for some people similar to me, once they realize what their porn search or their affair or whatever, what it symbolizes to them, they do have an immediate sense of, like, almost like antabuse, which is a drug that people take uh, when they're struggling with alcoholism. You can
Mhm.
take it after you drink or before you drink, and you just feel terrible with it. Sometimes when people understand, like, this is what I've been fantasizing about, there is a sense of, I just don't want this anymore.
Mm.
But for other people, porn was one of the first places that they actually found some level of power, some level of self-soothing in the midst of a family that was very disengaged from them. And that's really the harder work for people to outgrow. Is, I began to lean on this porn issue or sex in order to find something of self-soothing. But now, if I don't go to that, how am I able to self soothe? How am I able to get through some of the heartache of their life? And that's really that process of, I wouldn't say, how do they effectively quit porn, or do they quit an unwanted sexual behavior? But I use the language of outgrowing it.
Mm.
And yes, I think that this approach is kind of best designed for people that are looking for not like a cold turkey approach to, let's get rid of this, but let's learn what it means to outgrow this. No different than, what could be called a pacifier or some other kind of eh, surrogate form
Coping.
of
Yeah.
self-soothing. Yeah, you've got to learn what it symbolizes, what the strategy is, and then you can begin to replace it with behaviors that actually give you a lot of life instead of just shame. But you've
Yeah.
got to understand what the strategy is.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot us a little bit. I mean, we're
Great.
already on the track, right? Because
Yeah.
looking backwards at the messaging that we've been given, whether we sort of realize it then or not, is a segue to purity culture. But for
Hmm.
people listening that are like, what, well, they keep saying this term purity culture, what the heck is that? Why don't you give us sort of like a definition and a description of what we even mean when we use that term?
Yeah. Yeah. So, purity culture, I mean, I'm trying to remember the exact history of it. Sarah, if you know, please help me out. But I want to say, like, some of it was started by, like, Lifeway, like a Christian organization,
Hmm.
books, and where people would take a lot of these purity pledges and purity rings. But it was a sense of not just wanting to, abstain from sex until your wedding day, but it was actually to try to eliminate even a hint of lust for desire or sexual desire until that particular day. And so there was a lot of merch that came along with it. It
Yeah.
would be purity pledges and purity rings and purity balls, and you would sign,
Covenants.
What's a purity ball?
A purity ball, like the dad and daughter go to this dance, and
Okay, like
they have a
so
conversation
okay.
and exchange rings about her celibacy or something.
I don't know if it's like a baseball or
There's
dance.
not a ball involved at all.
Okay.
It's a gala. It's a dance.
Gotcha.
But
Yes.
there was also True Love Waits is a organization,
Mhm.
I guess, or a campaign that was involved in this, and they had their own merch and rings and such. And the messaging, at least my memory of this, because I'm a product of this. We said this before we started recording, that I grew up
Yeah.
right in the thick of purity culture, and I remember going to assemblies at school, and I went to a public school, but they would have people come in and talk about this, and then of course in youth group. And the
Wait,
message,
they talked about this at public school?
yeah, well, it was an optional assembly, but everyone went because maybe there was some incentivized, maybe you got extra credit or something. And I remember, it's so funny. It's a couple. I don't want to say too much because we're still Facebook friends, but it was a couple at the time that was dating. They were like seniors or something. And they were telling us all that they weren't having sex and how amazing that was or whatever, which was awesome. And the messaging that I heard was only ever, well, that I thought I heard was only ever the good stuff. It was like, listen, if you wait till marriage, it will be so much better. And this is God's design, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
And it was definitely a push for abstinence, but somewhere between the lines, and probably because of the youth group exercises, which I want to talk about here in a second,
Yes.
there was a subtle messaging which got through. I don't know if anyone ever really said, but sex is bad. You don't want to have sex. Sex is bad. Sex is wrong. And obviously that's not what we believe at all. If you've been listening to the rest of this podcast series, sex is very good, right? I mean, God made it and gave it to us and gifted it to us to be done a certain way, right? But still, but it's partly because of purity culture that I really, it worked for me. I'm one of the rare few who waited till my wedding night to do, the wrong, terrible thing. I'm saying that in jest a little bit, but that messaging was still there as I was married. Kind of anytime I would engage in sex, I would sort of feel guilty, even though I was doing it like, quote, the right way. So that's a little bit of my experience, but yeah, I mean, feel free to say some more about.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in kind of rural Virginia and went to a Southern Baptist high school during puberty, which was just not, it wasn't a great experience. And so in my school, one of the things that I remembered was, there would be just like terrible metaphors. Like I almost don't want to say it on air just because it's so detrimental, but it's like, we had someone come in from, I believe it was Liberty University, and so they would divide, adolescent boys from adolescent girls to kind of give them a talk. And so we were in a chapel service, and one of the speakers kind of came in, and he, compared purity a little bit to, he gave this reference to the Inuit people in Alaska, that if they are trying to kill a wolf, they dip a dagger into seal's blood, and then they put that dagger outside the camp. And so the wolves would come in because they would smell the blood, and then they would start licking the blood that was, casing the dagger. But then as the licking went on and the pleasure of the blood increased, the ice would melt, and then all of a sudden the wolf would be licking the blade and wouldn't be able to differentiate what was seal blood versus what was its own blood, and then the morning would be a dead wolf. And
if
no
you have
joke,
sex, you'll be a dead wolf.
No, exactly. And so no joke, the teacher turned around and just kind of said, there's a lot of you adolescent boys that are masturbating, and it feels good right now, but in the morning you're going to be spiritually dead because of it.
Wow.
And I
That's
remember like, yeah, I was like a
escalation.
senior in high school, and I just remember looking at all these horrified middle school students behind me that were just traumatized. So that was a lot of the messaging given to men was, we want to remain sexually pure until marriage, and we want to try and eliminate a lot of, even a hint of lust. But I think the messaging towards, girls and women were so much more worse, because it was a sense of like, you're not even sexual to begin with. And maybe you will find some sexual desire if you kind of wait until you're married, but not only should you not be sexual prior to marriage, but you need to make sure that men don't stumble on account of you. So it wasn't even to be responsible to steward one's own sexual story. It was also, in a way, to be responsible for the sexual life of other men and boys around you. And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
even in some of the popular Christian books around
Yep.
men outgrowing porn, one popular writer talks about how, like, when men are trying to outgrow porn, their wives need to present their bodies essentially as merciful vials of methadone to them.
Oh,
And that's really
lovely.
the, part of just the complete damage that purity culture did is, it made sex and arousal and desire something that was seen as bad, and then
Mm-hmm.
therefore something that you needed to eliminate, you needed to be harsh, you need to battle it, you needed to counter it. But then for women, it was a sense of like, yeah, you need to be modest and you need to protect men, and essentially be available for sex in order to help keep married men from using porn. So, I mean, it created so much debris in people's
Yeah.
sexual life. So, in terms of what you said, a lot of people would wait until their wedding day, and then the amount of entitlement that happened in a lot of marriages on their honeymoon
Uh-huh.
would leave many marriages a lot, to deal with the impact of that for decades to come. Or that sense of, if you've been taught, as you put so well, Sarah, like that sex is bad, you can't automatically just turn a switch
Mm-hmm.
and then begin to associate goodness and holiness and godliness and excitement with something that you have been groomed
Mm-hmm.
for, decades to see as bad and detrimental to your spiritual and relational flourishing. So I think of the word debris, but it's worse
Mm-hmm.
than debris. It's done so much damage.
Go ahead.
Well, I do just want to say, just to go back a little bit, I mean, this all
Yeah.
is a response to the sexual revolution or whatever, we want to call it. I
Hmm.
mean, there is carnage from that too, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No surprise that the church is extremely clumsy in dealing with so, personal or sensitive an issue, because we kind of just, we're simplistic sort of and often how we go about solving problems. But I mean, I do think that there was a pretty legitimate, and I actually think it's been more than borne out even in
Mm-hmm.
recent times of like dating apps. And some of the stories people are, there was a headline the other day where a woman said something like, in the last year since I've been on Tinder, I've had like 26 sexual experiences with 26 different men, none of which ever amounted to even a boyfriend girlfriend situation.
Hmm.
So there's carnage on both sides,
Yeah.
which we're not responsible for the world. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be taking a critical look at purity culture. I'm only saying that it was a
Hmm.
clumsy attempt to try to get this
Like a
thing right.
pendulum
So
shift so far the other way that
yeah,
instead of saying this is a good thing, but how can it be best,
yeah.
which is actually how my parents presented it. When I'm one of the rare people that when I heard the birds and the bees talk, it was like, this is such an amazing thing that can be so wonderful, especially if you do it the way that, God intended. But yeah, then the pendulum shifted to, well, if we make everyone think it's bad and scary and you'll get an STD and you'll get pregnant and you'll be used up,
Yeah.
then they won't do it. It's interesting the piece you were saying about women. The expectation is, or the messaging was, when you're a teenager and you're not supposed to be having sex, if you do, you'll be sort of used up, like, the rose they pass around and it's supposed to, leaves or petals are supposed to fall off, or the tape that's no longer stick at the
Or the
end.
lollipop.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Lots of people lick. And would you
Yeah.
want to lick it after 20 people have licked it or
Someone
whatever?
else is like, yes,
Um,
exactly.
but so it's, if you're not yet married and you have sex as a woman, you're probably doing it because you want like the love of a man and you're seeking it the wrong way, and don't be a
Hmm.
whore, right? And then once you're
Yeah.
married, present yourself a little bit of as a whore so that you can
Hmm.
satisfy his need for porn in another way. I remember being in graduate school.
Yes.
I went to a seminary for graduate school and I took an excellent class about the theology of human sexuality. And our
Mhm.
professor showed us a video. I won't say who the video was by, but it was a couple that was very prominent and writing lots of books about couples and sexuality. And she came on the video and talked about how, now women, I know you don't like sex, but
Mm.
you have to do this because you owe it to your man because you've made vows and you have to make that sacrifice. And of course, in the class, we talked about how it's wrong on so many levels, right? And it's so
It kills
broken.
desire. Yeah.
I mean, it's not a correct understanding of men and women to begin with. Men have a sex desire. Women just have to lay there and, pray that it's over soon or something. But it
Hmm.
also just turns something that's a gift into, first it's wrong, then it's a chore. That's so interesting about the women piece. Anyway, so in your research, when you were getting all those results back about people's unwanted, sexual behaviors, how do you think purity culture played into that? How do you think it affected people going
Hmm.
forward?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, whenever I'm looking at sexual problems and specifically unwanted sexual behaviors, I think of that as like similar to a river, like no different than the Mississippi River. So, one of the reasons why the Mississippi is so powerful is because it's not just one river. Like the
Mm-hmm.
Missouri flows into it, the Ohio, the Arkansas, the I don't know how many rivers flow into it, but that's one of the
Geography lesson
reasons
here. I love it.
why it's there. And so I think in a similar way, unwanted sexual behavior, you can't just look at one thing. You have to, it's not just like a la carte menu options that you get to pick or choose.
Mm-hmm.
This is one thing with many different tributaries to it. So, yeah, I think our theology of sex is something that we need to be far more responsible for. So, I think that's a very detrimental river throughout church history. Like Augustine used to kind of, in the Confessions, he wrote, the frenzy gripped me and I surrendered myself entirely to lust. And the lust that Augustine was referring to was not internet porn. This is like the fourth
Yeah.
century. For him, it was orgies. And
Oh,
so,
wow.
he hated himself for his
Mm-hmm.
sexual desire. And out of that, he developed very severe theologies around sex and sexual desire that he passed down to many generations. And that's part of, purity culture is on the downline of
Hmm.
a lot of Augustine's view of sex and kind of the need to move away from it. So I think we have to say yes, toxic theology, harmful theology is central to why we are the porn industry. When you have this much content available for free, and the 3 A's of addiction are anonymity, availability, and I said anonymity, availability, and,
Availability.
and affordability.
Okay.
And so when something is free, you can be anonymous and it's available 24/7.
Yeah.
You're going to get bonded to that material, no matter what it is. So that's the tributary, the family of origin that we grow up in. A lot of the rigidity or disengagement can leave us longing for experiences of power or being seen, being enjoyed that we can outsource to something like an
Mm-hmm.
affair or to porn. And so I think it's really that sense of we need to address all of it. That yes, purity culture is partially responsible, but the danger of partial truths is that I can just attack purity culture, but not
Mm-hmm.
address culture, or I can
Sure.
just, make culture the scapegoat, but not address that, you know, Christian families are often far more damaging than Pornhub to the
Mm.
sexual health and development of a child. So anytime you try and scapegoat one tributary, the other tributaries are just going to continue to flow to create more damage and problems in people's life. So that's where I would say we have to address all of them well. And purity culture is certainly one that we need to address with a lot more integrity and provide a vision of, human sexuality that isn't just about something to be managed or to be afraid of.
Yeah. Um, you said something about Christian families are often more destructive than Pornhub. And I've so partly because my parents did it really well, partly because of the great class I took at seminary, and maybe just my own wanting to be someone that like has transparency in our home. It's an ongoing conversation I've had with my kids. And I'm often really surprised when I talk to other parents that have kids that are like 10, 11, 12, 13.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, yeah, we haven't talked about that yet. I'm like, what? Like you have to
Yeah.
talk about that with I mean, obviously you don't talk about the full Monty to begin with. I mean, you're not explaining orgies to them when they're 9 or something, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
uh the class that I took, we talked about the 18-year long conversation. And it starts with like, you have special parts that God gave you that have a purpose, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on from there. But and I can't think of the name of the lady who you might know. She's written some books and she goes around doing talks about it. Her whole thing is to start sentences with by God's design. Like
Hmm.
by God's design, you have a part that will feel amazing when a person touches it or blah, blah, blah. And to keep
Yes.
putting that, do you know who that is that I'm thinking of?
I don't.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so the question then becomes, and when I was listening to the podcast with you in it, this part I was like, "Ooh, gulp. That's hitting close to home." She asked you like, so then how do we teach our kids or how do we do a better job preparing them for this? Because we don't want our kids just going out and, looking at porn or having casual sex for
Hmm.
obvious reasons, but we also don't want to shame them. So like, how do we do it? And you said something like, the first step is to sort of like identify and take care of your own sexual woundedness. So I'm curious about, yeah,
Hmm.
how do we teach the next generation without shaming them?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly what I said there, but yes. So Swiss psychiatrist by the name of Carl Jung used to say something along the lines of like, you can take no one further than you have been yourself. So that's true in a spiritual sense, in a counseling sense, but certainly with parenting. So Jung would say that the greatest risk to the life of a child is the unlived life of his or her parent. And so that sense of if you are a mother or a father who has struggled with promiscuity, who has struggled with pornography, and you have not worked through what's the meaning of that and why did I get into that, you're going to bring a lot of that unresolved energy to your kids. So you might try and protect them from all things. You might try and shame them into compliance. And so what you're doing is you're not actually tending to your story. You are trying to control your child's story so that
Mm-hmm.
you can, you know, avoid having to deal with the crucible of your own life. So
Mm-hmm.
if you've got to pay attention that, what are the places that I'm excited to talk to my kids about sex? What are the places that I am anxious and
Mm-hmm.
depressed to be able to even have these conversations? So you can always start with what you're excited about. Like I've had some clients who have been nurses and they will talk about like they are so excited to talk to their kids about what a penis is, what a vulva is. And so
Mm-hmm.
the anatomy for for someone like a nurse, that's very exciting. But then to get into like more of relationships and
Mm-hmm.
sex and like pornography, like that was an area of a lot more noise for her. So you can always start with like, what is the thing that as a parent you can do really well? But then talk to a therapist, read some good books like, Sheila Gregoire's The Great Sex Rescue is a really good one for uh, evangelical couples to understand the evangelical view of sex and how that has led to a lot of difficulties in relationship to sex and sexual intimacy as a couple. So that's where I would start is kind of where in my story do I feel anxious? Do I feel unprepared to talk about that? And do some of your own work in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you don't know the right answer, that's fine. You can say, like, that's a really good question, and I'll come back and answer that in a week. So
Mm-hmm.
one therapist talks about it in terms of we don't want to have one 100-minute, or we don't want to have one 100-minute conversation with our kid about sex. We want to have 101-minute
Mm-hmm.
conversations with our kids about sex. And that's, exactly what you could say. By God's design, we were given a penis, a vulva, and these are very good.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you want to start with, I think about it in terms of being responsive and then also being proactive. So a responsive conversation would be, they're getting to be teenagers, they're working with cell phones, and you hear about something about sexting on the news, like in Houston or some
Mm-hmm.
city, and you're like, hey, I heard that there was something from sexting that happened at your middle school. What do you think
Mm-hmm.
about that? Do you know what sexting is? Here is what sexting is. How do you think that person would feel if their, image got passed around?
Yeah.
So you can respond to the movies that you're seeing, songs that you're hearing, things that are coming up in cultural events. But
Yeah.
then the other side would be proactive. And so part of what we know from adolescent boys is that from the age of 13 to 15, the amount of testosterone in their system goes from about a shot glass up to a pint glass in just 2 years. So
You're
it's this
speaking
huge
theology on
rush
tap
of,
language now. That's good.
yeah, huge rush of testosterone. They want to touch
Hmm.
everything. I mean, a desire to masturbate multiple times a day is going to come over that adolescent system. And so if the only language that that adolescent has is like godliness, holiness, or evil, there are so many people that I have counseled that thought that something in them was becoming evil around the ages of 14 or 15 because they had sexual
Oh,
desire and they
desire.
weren't married. And so
Yeah.
that's a really good proactive conversation for a kid that's like, 11, 12. Like, your body by God's design is going to go through some amazing changes. And here's part of what it's going to feel like, and here's part of
Hmm.
what it's going to be like. Or, this doesn't happen as much, but many women have gone through their period and had no idea what was happening and thought that
Yep.
they were dying.
Yep.
I wish I could say I've only heard that story under 10 times, but it's been dozens that I've heard
Hmm.
about it in the last couple of years. So that's another proactive conversation, is preparing people for the world that they're about to encounter, whether it's porn or preparing them for the bodies that they have.
Yeah.
And most of us, the sad reality is that we didn't have a church or a family system or a community that most prepared us. And so that's part of our work as adults, is to get sex education that we've never had. And so I think earlier this year, there was a lot of traction on one of my Instagram posts just around adult sex ed, and
Adult
received
sex
like
ed. I love it.
yeah, like dozens of messages from men and women saying, what are the best books for that? And let's get this going in our local city or neighborhood or church. And that's what I'm most excited about, is the prophets and the scriptures definitely tore down systems and idolatries that needed to
Hmm.
die, that needed to burn. But to be a good prophet, you can't just tear down. You have to build up a vision of something so beautiful, so
So much
compelling,
better. Yeah.
that people can follow. And I think that's really the Christian sex ed or adult sex ed is like, yes, let's deconstruct purity culture and name it for the heartache and the damage that it did. But then as we begin to tear down something, we're also in the process of reconstructing something else. And
Yeah.
let's pick up the pen, let's pick up the building supplies and kind of get a vision of an understanding of sex education and sexual flourishing that we actually feel good about building. So
Yeah. I want to ask one more question about talking to our kids.
yeah.
This is totally selfish because I have teenagers. Um, Pornography. I mean, we talked about porn some as far as like just why the desire for that might exist, but when you're
Mhm.
sort of, I hate to say battling because that's one of those words, right? But I think porn is pretty evil, and it's every freaking where. I mean, I just recently saw this thing about teenagers going on Spotify and just looking up videos, like music videos, and then just being hit with a list of pornographic images and
Mhm.
pornographic, I guess, music videos. I mean, it's horrifying. And even if the like no explicit music thing is on, which my daughter has to have that on, but she could still
Mhm.
have porn just come up on her phone if she's looking up like, a music video for Kanye. Well, maybe not Kanye West these days, but whoever. Um,
Yeah.
so with it so prevalent and sneaking into everything, I mean, Spotify with that guard on should be a safe place for her to be able to go listen to music, right? What are your suggestions about how to talk to kids, especially teenagers, like high schoolers, about
Mhm.
pornography? I mean, part of me does want to scare her, not scare her at a like you'll be bad, but man, it will make things worse for you in all these ways. Or do I
Mhm.
take the approach of like think of the people in it? Or I mean, yeah, maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Oh, I mean, they are very complex waters to not, I
Yeah.
mean, within parenting, you can try to control or you can disengage, right? So good parenting almost always comes down to the categories of attunement and containment. So attunement is about seeing into the needs and desires of a kid, and trying to, respond generously, be kind,
Hmm.
uh, err on the side of like how do I be kind in the midst of what this person's going through? But then as a parent, we also have to be able to say no. We have to be able to provide some containment
Mm-hmm.
for the home, and that's really the balance. So when you're thinking about attunement, is I wouldn't trust a lot of the parental controls, even if they say that they're operating, because these companies are not highly incentivized to protect kids. I mean, it's like a lot of these apps are very much geared towards, I mean, no different than big tobacco or OxyContin.
Yeah.
They are designed to be able to get users very early and
Mm.
pump them with it. So I wouldn't trust that, when something says parental control, I wouldn't accept that, don't trust a major corporation to kind of protect your kids. So
Yeah.
organizations like Protect Young Eyes on Instagram have very active accounts around parental controls. So I think from a parental control and what's out there, you can go to some good resources out there. But in terms of the actual conversation, yeah, like you want to have, if the average age of the initial exposure is 9 for boys and 11 for girls, it could be younger depending
Insane.
on the study. You got to
Yeah.
have these conversations before it even gets there. So some of the popular books out there will, especially in a faith-based or religious leaning, will talk about like, basically when you see porn, run away and go tell someone. I get that language and would love if my kid would just tell me each time they saw porn, but the reality is that we have to prepare them for when they see it, and they may not want to run. Maybe they're deeply
Yeah.
intrigued by the
They're
image.
curious.
Maybe
I mean, my goodness, I
exactly.
would be.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the language, is like when you see something for the first time, you're going to be aroused by it. And by God's design, you are allowed to be aroused by content that you've never seen before. So there is some difference between physiological and genital
Mm.
arousal, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
I'm driving down I-10 and I see a car accident somewhere in Texas, like I'm going to be aroused and there's going to be a slowdown because I've never seen that before. And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that can be part of the experience of arousal, of like, I've never seen this image or this.
The newness of
Uh,
it. Yeah.
yeah. And so
Novelty.
being able to prepare people for like, you're going to respond to novelty, and then you're gonna want to go back and see it again. And you might want to, be secretive with that. And I want you to
Yeah.
know that like the response to that and the desire and the arousal and the desire to be secretive, those are all really good and normal things. That there's something about God's design that sex and intimacy is meant to be not quite
Private.
secretive, but it's
Yeah.
private. And your desire to know more of it, like that's all going to happen. So I think
That's built in. Yeah.
we can frame all that not as something that they need to run away from and be afraid of, but it's something that we can bless arousal very early on in someone's life, but then ask the questions of like, what is the best experience for this? And if your image were up on the
Yeah.
internet, what would you feel about these things? So we also have to, the great philosopher Levinas used to talk about ethics begins in the face of the other. And I think these are good conversations for parents and teens to have around ethics. And what does it mean to have your face up on the internet and be exploited in porn? And is this
Mm-hmm.
by God's design that images and sexual acts would be up? And what do we do with all the porn performers out there that like are trying to get these images removed but can't, and talk about the
Yeah.
Mhm.
destructiveness and the wickedness of what they were involved in?
Or the
So
human trafficking that's happening
yeah.
there.
So I think
Yeah.
that's what we need to be doing as teens is, porn has images of racism that are always up there. So fetishes and, especially from an American context, how do we think about Asian women and purity culture and whiteness and all of these factors? Like there's so much racism embedded within purity culture and within whiteness as kind of the best. And how does that play into sexual exploitation? So I think like if we see these things as not just threats to our family system, but as really important cultural and theological conversations that we need to be having, I think that's what we want to frame. Is it's
Yeah.
not a don't screw up model, but it's like all of this is data for us to talk about, for us to have relational conversations about. And you're not bad for wanting it, and you're not, someone that's going to be yeah, we're not just going to act as if this is insignificant in our home either, because it is. So I
Yeah.
think that's all the attunement side. The containment side might be, 24/7. We need to have, maybe as a family, we put cell phones on the kitchen counter at 10 p.m., or the Griffin router is a really good router for parents to get. And, we're going to shut down the internet at 10, and devices need to be, and that's not just to like prevent you from finding porn. It's like your sleep is going to be
Yeah.
very important to rates of anxiety, rates of depression are all sleep and social media related. So I think that's where the containment side comes in, is like, but we are going to have some parameters, some rules in our family that are actually designed for your flourishing.
Yeah.
And, part of what I would say about rigid families is a rigid family has lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of shame, but the root word of discipline is actually to teach. And so that's really the litmus test of a good family is, are the rules and regulations designed to teach kids, or are they used and designed to be able to shame them into compliance?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
a
No,
lot
that's
of Christian families use discipline to shame people into compliance, not to teach them to understand their bodies, or to teach them how to understand and navigate this internet world that we're living in.
yeah. No, that's good. I mean, I have a million more questions. Sadly, we're kind of rounding out our time, but I do like sort of being okay with talking about the good parts of the bad things. I say bad things
Yes.
with quotes. I mean, there are a lot
Yeah.
of bad things about pornography, but I like what you were saying about what your body does when it sees that that is not intrinsically bad. You were built that way.
Hmm.
Let's explore that, and let's explore what the best way would be to use, not use that, but explore that more.
Hmm.
So I appreciate that. And your book talks a lot about that. And man, I wanted to get in all of the stuff about like anger and lust, especially with men. And but if people are interested in all of this, they're just going to have to go read the book or get it on Audible
Hmm.
like I did. I was really worried that this book, sometimes you get a book on Audible and the voice that reads it is sort of creepy. And I'm like, I can't be listening to a creepy voice talking about unwanted sexual behavior. Thankfully, he's very normal sounding. So
Okay. I have
um
not listened to it yet. I've listened
not
to
even
maybe
a little
3 minutes,
bit, just to make
like
sure he
three
didn't
minutes.
sound like a
Well,
creeper.
like I don't know who controls all this, like if it's my publisher or if it's just like something like Amazon. But when you listen to the Amazon like sample of my book,
Yeah.
it's like it just goes into the deep end, like degradation against
Yeah,
women
yeah,
is at the
yeah.
heart of, and I'm like, oh, this is not like what I want people
But
that
that's
are
the hook,
struggling with.
right?
And
It's dramatic.
I
So
guess
that's what
so.
people want.
I would pick a
But
different starting point, but
I think that's what I appreciated most about your book was, hey, instead of saying all sexual fantasies are bad or all
yeah,
sexual like lust, instead of just saying it's bad, stop doing that and continuing the shame spiral, it's like, well, let's explore what is the fantasy? Where
yes.
did that come from? And it's a unique approach, and I think it's really interesting. So if people want to read
And
that, it's
that's
called
like
Unwanted. Go
and
ahead.
that's the Romans 12:2 of like, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Like, we want our sexual minds to be renewed. And if you don't know what is inside them, you're not going to be able to transform them. And so what I hope my book really offers to people is an opportunity to get inside their sexual fantasy mind, to get into these, I refer to it as unwanted sexual behavior, just because I think it's not that we don't also have wanted sexual behavior that
Hmm.
brings us shame, but I think at the end of the day, there's often fantasies or behaviors that we wish were gone from our life. And I just want people to be really curious about why they might be drawn to those things.
Yeah.
And curiosity will always take us further than willpower or trying to
Right.
shame ourselves into obedience. It just,
Yeah.
they don't work.
Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more, how can they find you or your book? What's the place to go to?
Website is jay-stringer.com, or Instagram jstringer. But my website will have a lot of links to various places to get the book, other resources, assessments, courses, all that kind of stuff, depending on how deep of a dive people want to take.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this with us. I really appreciate it. Did you have anything else you want to add before
No, that's
we round
fantastic.
up?
No, that's great.
Okay. Well, then listeners, if you want more, go to the website. If you want to know more about us, of course, HoustonTOT.com. And until we see you next time, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.